Yes.
Yes, lovely.
Okay. Before I get into the detail, and I'm aware I'm talking to the Egypt Study Circle, so it may be you will know this, but the history is very relevant to this presentation. The history is that Egypt, under the Pasha dynasty, established in 1805, owed nominal allegiance to the Ottoman Empire, but was pretty much self-governing. In 1869, the Suez Canal opened, and Britain and France decided that this was their strategic interest at stake. So they had a lot of influence in Egypt. I believe their diplomats even sat in on Egyptian cabinet meetings. For a number of reasons, local discontent, nationalist revolts and so on, the British actually invaded in 1882 and troops were stationed there in Egypt right through to the Suez Crisis in 1956. At the start, we didn't treat Egypt as a colony or a conquest. The Egyptians carried on managing themselves, as I said, nominally under the Ottoman Empire. But we had lots of troops stationed in the country and there was nothing they could do about it. In the First World War, of course, the Ottomans sided with the Germans, so we declared Egypt a protectorate. And then in 1922, I think it was, we signed a treaty saying you're independent. Oh, by the way, there's thousands of our troops stationed in your country and you can do nothing about it. But I say, in theory, Egypt was then independent. And this led to a number of sometimes quite tricky relationships between the Egyptians and the British. And one of them was the postal system. One of the agreements was that the British troops in Egypt could use military post boxes, but the mail had to carry Egyptian stamps, and they put it into the military post boxes, and the military postal authorities promptly passed them on to the Egyptians for processing and sending on, normally, of course, back to GB and ERA. And in 1932, the Egyptians saw an opportunity, so raised the international postal rate from 10 milem or 1 piastra to 15, a 50% increase in price. The troops complained, and in the end, a deal was cut between the British military authorities, primarily the Army and the Air Force. The Navy did have a small base at Port Said, but really in the southeastern Mediterranean water was more their concern. And the deal was that the military authorities would pay the Egyptians 10,000 sterling in the first year and 6,000 sterling in every subsequent year. And the Egyptians would then accept from the military any mail passed over to them. This then raised a tricky issue of, well, how do we get the money back, or at least some of it? And the Egyptians were adamant, you're not going to use British stamps, you're in Egypt, and we're not going to process stamps carrying the head of a foreign sovereign. And in the end, a very curious deal was struck. This next sheet, I'm sorry, it hasn't really come over very well, so I'll just explain it. Basically, the British said to the troops that they could carry on paying a 10 milem rate, and that this was done with some complicated arrangements with what was initially termed a postal seal, which had to be put on the back of an envelope with a crown council, the Egyptian crown, not the British crown. I'll show a bit more detail of that in a minute. And a CDS, either a military post office CDS or a local Egyptian one, and I'll explain the difference as well. So I now got to just do rotate view if I can get this right. So this map shows the detail of the various British bases in Egypt, and the numbers of these crown councils are allocated to those bases. A lot at Cairo, a lot at Muasca near to Abu Sur, where the principal RAF base was, and other bases on the coast. Let's get into a bit more information about these crown councils. So if I just scroll down, and now I've got to reverse that view, just excuse me. Here we go. So I'm just going to expand a bit. This here this item here is a crown cancel. This had to go on the front of the envelope. It was applied by the British military postal authorities, and it had a number in the centre between 1 and 25, denoting which particular military post office was involved. As I said, that crown is the Egyptian crown, and this went on the front of the envelope. Now, the seal went on the back, and I'll talk about the seal in a minute. But the seal was cancelled by a letter, and this was also cancelled by the British military postal authorities and on the base. Both the crown cancels and the letters were supplied by the Egyptians. The mail was then passed over to the Egyptians in one of two ways. In the big bases, Cairo and Madagascar, you'd have a military post office cancel. And the reason was that the mail was bagged up after these cancels were applied. And then it was just passed over to the Egyptians, who had to do nothing more than put it on the next train to Alexandria, where it was then shipped off to, usually to GB. In the smaller bases, the mail was sent loose to the Egyptians with a crown cancel and with a letter cancellation on the seal, and a local Egyptian hand stamp would be applied. And you can see the design is very similar, the obvious difference being in the top half of the cancel on the MPO, it says MPO, and on the Egyptian ones, it has the Egyptian wording for, in this case, Abu Qir. So those were these rather strange arrangements. And let's have a look at the seals. And in 1932, the first design was issued, the 10 mm, which is equivalent to 1 piastre. And it says postal seal, British Forces in Egypt. And this logo here is the NAFI, Navy, Army and Air Force Institute, which was a administration for troops, food and other kind of non-military items. And these seals were purchased in the NAFI. And here is an item on peace with a letter cancellation on the postal seal. That notice I skipped over earlier, because it's such a poor copy, only talked about the 10 mm rate. It was also decided that there would be a concessionary Christmas rate of 3 mm, only on unsealed mail, and only going to Britain or Era, and indeed these postal seals went as well. This was a completely different design. It was designed by a chap in the Army Service Corps, and you can see here it says quite clearly Xmas seal and 3 mm. So there's a mint pair, and there's an example on cover. And again, it was cancelled with a letter, and then the two hand stamps that I mentioned earlier, the Crown Council and a CDS, in this case from the MPO in Cairo. So that's how the arrangements all work. I should say in passing that some people think that this is the first ever Christmas stamp. And you'll say to me, no, what about Canada 1898, which has Xmas on it? Well, it certainly does have Xmas on it, but in my view, it wasn't a Christmas commemorative stamp. It was actually issued to commemorate the starting of the Empire Penny Post. Although I collect this material, I honestly can't say that this is a commemorative stamp either. It was created to have a different value from the 10 mm or 1 piastre stamp. But as we'll see, this design lasted several years. So those are the basic arrangements. I'll go on to talk about pieces on cover. But first of all, on the 1932 issue, here are a couple, I'll just reduce the scale a bit. Here are a couple of imperforate examples. These can be found, they're a little bit difficult, and these probably did not come from the NAFI, but would either be in the printer's archive or perhaps imprimatur seats sent to the post office. So these are all examples of the 1 piastre or 10 mm postal seal. Now, before I go on, I should say, in my view, and actually in Gibbon's view as well, these are really stamps. I think they were called seals to assuage Egyptian sensibilities. But let's think about it. It was an adhesive item. It had to be bought in advance. It had to be attached to the mail, and it had to be cancelled. sounds an awful lot like a stamp to me. And in fact, from now on, I'll refer to them as stamps, although some of them do carry the word seal. Here are a couple of examples with unusual red or purple cancellations. Most of the cancellations were in black. Now, the first item on cover is a rather rare item. This is Crown Council number 7. And why is it rare? Well, we don't exactly know why, but the story goes that in March 1933, this cancel was lost down a well in Moasca. So it only was used from 1st of December 1932, when these arrangements came into being, and March 1933. Because of this possibly apocryphal story about falling down a well, these are very collectible and very hard to find. But you can see an example here. It's got the 7, which was allocated to Moasca. You can see the MPO Moasca there. This will be one of those examples of mail that was sent back to the Egyptians. And on the reverse, a nice 1 piastre stamp with a crown, with a retta cancel. Sorry. In fact, this could have been sent using the 3 mm rate, but either the sender wanted to seal the envelope, or perhaps it wasn't a rare because the 3 mm rate came a little bit later. And that's an example of one of the rare, in fact, probably the rarest crown cancel, number 7. Here's another example. One of the things about collecting this material is you have to show the front and the back. So you'll see sometimes I show the front with a scan of the back, and sometimes vice versa. But here's a nice seal on the back, cancelled, and on the front, MPO numeral 8, which is Moasca, and again the MPO Moasca cancelled on the front there. Another item from Moasca. This is a bit later, July 1933, sent to a school in Dunblane in Scotland. Now, this is a slightly unusual item. As I said, when the mail was sent unbagged to the Egyptians, they were supposed to cancel it with their circular date stamp and pass it on. But this has actually got a machine cancellation. You do see these. They do apply, but this is a little bit unusual. It's got a port side Egyptian cancel on it there. And this was sent in January 1933. I've put it upside down so you could see the nice Egyptian machine cancel there. And there's the front with the crown cancel for number 12 and a hand stamp, the Abu Sir hand stamp there. So why it then went through a machine, I'm not quite sure. Obviously, it was passed on from Abu Suair to Port Said, and that may explain why they then put it through a machine cancel as well. There's a lot of background noise. I wonder if whoever can hear talking in their background wouldn't mind muting, please. Now, the 3mm Christmas seal is quite hard to find on cover, but here's quite a nice example with a very clear retta on it. You can see the Xmas seal, and this was Alexander Abu Qir with an Egyptian cancel on it. This is really quite hard to find, and unfortunately, although it's got the right things on the front, the crown cancel and the Egyptian cancel, I don't think this is a window envelope. I think the address has actually been cut out, but that's the best example I can find of this for the moment. Now, in 1933, there was a couple of changes. So if you remember, in 1932, it says on here postal seal. In 1933, it was changed to say letter seal. And this is the 1933 issue, the mint stamp and a used example. And they use the same die for the Xmas seal, but now they use a different color. In fact, the Xmas seal appears in the 4 years I'm going to talk about. And each time it was printed in a different color. This is Brown Lake. If you remember, this one is in black. Now the Xmas seal in the following year was printed in brown lake. Here's an example on cover. This time I'm showing the front, the back is scanned. Number 6 Cairo, and a nice clear MPO Cairo, November 33, and there's the letter seal on the back with a slightly scruffy letter cancel. Another example with the letter seal on the back cancelled, and on the front somewhat poor quality. It's MPO Cairo cancel and Egyptian crown cancel 4. I rather like this one because it's addressed to Guernsey, and one of my other collecting interests is Guernsey, so I love it where you can use the same item in different presentations. There's not a lot of mail that I've found from Egypt to Guernsey, so this is quite a nice example for me. This is unusual. This is a postcard. That's the front of the postcard, a relatively poor quality photo of a garden in Alexandria. And postcards, you could use letter seals, but you had obviously a lot less room to write. And most people would prefer to use letters because you could say a lot more. But for whatever reason, this was sent on a postcard. Of course, all the items now have to appear on the reverse. So there you've got the letter cancel. You've got the crown cancel number 17, which is allocated to Abu Sur, and you've got the local Egyptian post office cancel there. Just try and remember that cancel, because we'll see later a different example of an Alexandria cancel. They're nearly all this design except for the one I'll show later. So this is a bit unusual because it's a postcard rather than a letter. This is another one, and again, bear with me, I've just got to rotate the view. This is OHMS going back to the RAOC, Royal Army Ordnance Corps barracks in Colchester, and it's got a rather nice Abbasiyah RAOC Council for the 5th of May, but it actually went from Cairo, you can see here, the MPO, on the 6th of May, and that's a 6 allocated to Cairo. My only guess is that that local branch of the RAOC didn't have a post box, because Abbasiyah is, I think, about 40 miles from Cairo, and it travelled there overnight, presumably, because there's the 5th of May when it was dispatched from the RAOC barracks, and it was then put into the post in Cairo on the 6th of May. And again, on the back, we've got a nice 1 piastre postal seal, stamp capsule with a retta. Now I've got to go back again. And this is the Christmas seal. These are a little bit easier to find. This is a somewhat unusual item. It's that the Xmas seal hasn't been cancelled with a retta. And technically it should have been taxed. It's got MPO Cairo on it. And remember that this mail would just go into the bag. The Egyptians wouldn't look at it. They just put the bag on the train. So I think the postal clerk forgot to put the retta on, but it just went into the bag, and there was no opportunity for Egyptian postal authorities to look at it and possibly tax it. But this was sent in December 1933, within the period when the 3 mm stamps were valid for unsealed mail. That's the end of the first part. I've got quite a lot more to show. David, I don't know whether you want to have questions and discussions now, or wait till I show the second part.
Let's see what members think. Any questions now, or comments? Does anyone else specialise in this area?
Yeah, Mick Carter. I've been specialising on this for about 10, 12 years now, and I was totally unaware that Julian was involved in it till, I think about 2 years ago. And I was very intrigued to see this collection of his today. And I didn't know that the crown that was on the front of the cover was an Egyptian crown until I did a display at Leiston very recently, and someone there told me that it was a Egyptian crown. That's the only time I realised it, actually. But
Mick, have you got John Davies' book?
yeah, I've got all three of them.
Okay, well, I think he mentioned somewhere in there it's an Egyptian crown,
You
but
probably
there's so much material in that book, it's hard to remember it all.
well, his books, I tell everyone, are absolutely superb.
They are.
And,
They are.
you know, the research he's done on it, and that is amazing. And as we know, he sold his collection only about 2 months ago.
I know. I was very annoyed. I didn't find out about it till afterwards because he had some wonderful material.
I've got some of his material, the stuff that in his book. I've got some of it actually. So
All right.
he must have got rid of some of it, and I've picked it up somewhere. But I find it a fascinating area, and those Christmas seals, one of them's in dark blue and the other is in black, and it's very difficult to tell the difference at times. And
Yeah. I think it's like a lot of those shade things. You've got to put them side by side, then you can spot it. But one on its own.
yeah, I bought one at auction which was allegedly black, and I sent it back again. I've now got one, so I'm okay there. But
Yeah,
yeah,
because that 1932 black on cover is quite hard to find.
yes, I've got them all on cover. I've got yeah. Anyway, I just wanted to say that I do collect it like Julian. I don't know how many other people collect it as a specialist collection, but I've been at it for 10 years now, and I'm learning all the time. And those books of John Davies are like gold dust, really, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah. All right. Shall I roll on to the other part of the? Because we got up to the end of 1933, and there's lots more to talk about. So shall I crack on, and then
Yes,
we
please.
can talk again at the end? Okay. So now we come to 1934, and I need to expand a bit on the seals. Things changed again. The printer was changed. The 1932 and 33 printers was, can't remember, but the 1934 was Harrison and Sons. And the 1932 and 1933 issues were 500,000 each, and there were relatively few remaindered. So obviously what Harrison and Sons did, probably on military instructions, was print 250,000, and they ran out. So they then did a second printing, and for reasons that I don't think's in John's book, they changed the colour from carmine to green. But here are examples of them. You can see a completely different design. Now we've got an Egyptian Sphinx. We've got the value twice. And now it says, remember, before first we started with postal seal, then we had letter seal. Now reality intrudes and it's a letter stamp. You can see that here.
Yeah.
So there's Minton used examples of both the colours, and as Mick was saying earlier, the colour changes again on the 3mm seal, and this is now deep blue. And as he says, unless you put it side by side, it's sometimes quite hard to spot that it is deep blue and not black, the black being somewhat rarer. So we'll start off with the carmine issues on cover. And here's a nice example there with the Ressa Cancel. And this is actually going to the Stamp Collecting magazine, which was going in those days, amalgamated after the war, and in 1984 acquired by Stamp News, in 86 closed down. So there's a nice Crown Council 1 and MPO Moasca there. And this was sent in November 1934. The next example is again the carmine, this time, of course you can't really see it because these are copies, but the original, I've got the front showing a nice Alexandria. It's actually a transit stamp, but they put it on with a Crown Council 17 there, Abu Sur, if I remember rightly. and the stamp on the back with a fairly poor and scruffy Retta cancel on it. Coming to the Christmas issue for this year, here we've got the Christmas seal, and this has been cancelled with a Retta, but also a couple of Alexandra routing and Alexandra CDSs on the rear, which was technically not correct, but you do get this sort of stuff occasionally. And you get on the front, Crown Council 13, allocated to Abukir, and in fact 2 Crown Councils, which is quite unusual. My guess is that the clerk decided that this one was a bit indistinct and poor, so slapped a second one on here, and that and the Abukir cancellation should have been all that's needed. So I think these 2 at the back are probably more transit cancelled. This one going in 17th of December, 34, probably made it back before Christmas, probably. Another Xmas issue, this is a really odd one. There's the front. There's nothing on the front except the address. There's no Crown Council. There's no military or local postmark. And on the back, there's no Retta, but there is a somewhat indistinct Egyptian local CDS. This is all a bit odd. There's 2 explanations. One is that it was put into an Egyptian post box. If so, it should have been taxed because you can only put these items into military post boxes. Or it was put into an unsealed bag, sent to the Egyptians. They realized that the postal clerks, whichever was the originating MPO office, had been a bit lazy, hadn't cancelled it properly. Either way, they decided not to tax it, and they didn't have a Retta because the Rettas are on the base. So they put one of their cancels on it, and by the look of it, it went through, and it went through without being taxed. As I said, for reasons I could never understand, the print run for this stamp was much lower than the previous years, and they ran out, and so then they rather hastily issued a second print run, this time in green rather than carmine. And there's a fairly clear example. It is used, but the Retta is a bit indistinct. And on the front, we've got a 23 for Cairo, and a nice MPO Cairo there, and an address to a commercial bank, which is actually a subsidiary of a Greek bank, if I remember rightly. Another green item. There's the stamp on the back, and on the front, a different Crown Council numeral for Cairo again, 19, and a very clear MPO Cairo hand stamp on the front. Yet another one, Muascar this time, Crown Council 1, allocated to Muascar, and there's the Retta Council on the stamp on the rear. Another green one, this one going to the RAC Club in London, with 21 for Cairo, MPO Cairo. And I've shown this one because one of the ways you can distinguish the carmine, not the green issue, from a later issue, which is pale carmine, is they didn't have a pinhole in the corner. And you can see here, you get this lump sometimes, because when you tear it off, there wasn't a pinhole here to regulate the tearing. So you sometimes get these lumps. And unfortunately, it's on a green, not a red, but that's one of the ways you can tell if you're dealing with an early or a late carmine issue. This next one is, to me at least, fascinating. It's sent from, there's the green on the back, and an Alexandria local hand stamp, with an Abukir local hand stamp there, and a Crown Council. That's 13. It's a bit hard to read. Now, why is this fascinating? Well, it's gone to something called the Road Maintenance and Store Supply at Thames House in Westminster. Well, at the time, ICI owned the Thames House building, but a lot of it was actually MI5. And my guess is that this was a clandestine address actually for MI5, although it's been redirected to a woman in Sussex, not quite sure why. And that explains the second machine cancel on the front. But I've looked through, and I haven't gone into detail in the archives, but I can't find any reference to this road maintenance organisation. So I think it may well have been a clandestine address for MI5, probably to Mr. Harris by the look of it, who was either staying with or had some relationship with Mrs. Gillam in Lancing in Sussex. But I do quite like these sort of odd items. And here's another one, very odd. This is a completely mistaken item. It's an envelope addressed to someone with a field ambulance division in Egypt. But for some reason, the sender put a stamp on the rear with an MPO Cairo cancel. And obviously the MPO didn't look at the address. They just saw the stamp, thought it must be for Britain, so put it in the bag for GB. It took a long while for GB to work out that actually it should have gone within Egypt. And the London Foreign Section, nearly 2 months, it's over 2 months after it was originally posted, sent it back. There, I mentioned the Alexandria stamp earlier. This is the only one I think, and I think Davis recalls this in his book, it's the only hand stamp with this sort of design rather than the two bars, horizontal bars that we see on virtually all the others. And if my memory serves me right, this is similar to more First World War hand stamps. But this hand stamp was used by the MPO in Alexandria. And then when this finally got back to Egypt, someone said that this unit, RAMC unit, was out in Sidi Barrami, which is out in the desert. So presumably, eventually, it got to its correct destination. But there's I have no understanding why someone put a postal stamp on an internal item for the military within Egypt. So it had a bit of a round journey before, presumably, it finally got to its destination. After that green issue was exhausted, a further carmine issue was issued. And this is the 1935 issue. And you can see here a nice reta cancel on the back and a nice crown cancel MPO Moasca there. I'm sorry, the scanner didn't seem to pull out the address. Another carmine issue. This one from Abu Sur, a rather nice embossed envelope on the rear for the training school at Abu Sur, which was quite a famous RAF training school. And this one is going to England. Again, we've got a machine cancel on the front and the back. Again, there isn't actually a crown cancel on this one. And there isn't a reta cancel on the stamp. So this may well have been put into the Egyptian Postal Service, or if it went through the military postal service, then it must have gone loose. Otherwise, it wouldn't have got these Egyptian machine cancels on it. So a slightly unusual item there. It could have gone at the 3 min rate, but I don't know whether the writer decided that it was sensitive and wanted to seal it, because it went at the full rate in 14th of December 35, when the Christmas rate would certainly have applied. Another pale carmine here, going to Kent with a nice number 3. And now we've got MPO Alexandria, because in preparation to some extent for changes in these arrangements, which isn't part of this presentation. Some of these numbers were reallocated, and some of the MPOs then started to process the mail themselves without Egyptian local CDSs on them. And there's a pale carmine with a nice reta cancellation. Chris. He sent mail to all sorts of people. What was the name? Fred someone, the philatelic correspondent of the Telegraph, wrote an article about it. George V read it and thought, oh, I'd like some of those for my collection. So wrote to the commanding officer Salonika, who said, what stamps? And Piri Gordon got court-martialed, but they decided he'd acted in, but he was doing it for philatelic reasons. He was the same guy that produced those type Long Island stamps that you may see that go for very large amounts of money.
Oh, yeah.
So I think, yeah, the army does, well, let's say the forces do have form when it comes to thinking about philatelic issues in the middle of war.
It's initiative. It's called initiative.
Yeah, indeed, yeah.
I mean, I don't know how many of our society members actually do collect British forces in Egypt.
Not as many as it used to be.
No. No, when I gave the display at Leiston recently, somebody there made the comment that probably the reason that people aren't collecting them anymore is because those who are in the Egypt before, during and after the war are now dying off, and there's not many people got that much interest in the military in Egypt.
I'm 100% correct. Sure, you're correct. When I joined the society in the late 70s, almost everyone had a collection of British military. Nowadays, Mick, you're the only one I know apart from John Davis
and Julian.
Sorry, well, Julian is a non-member.
Oh, is he?
Yeah, and yeah. And I find it. I find it fascinating, all this stuff about the seal on the back, the Crown Council on the front, and so on. The fact that to do a display properly, you have to show front and back.
Yeah.
I would have thought that was philatelically very interesting, but Mick's right. You don't see much interest in this.
No. One of the reasons I don't collect British military is because there are so many different facets to Egyptian philately that there are just too many.
Yeah.
Well, that's the reason I don't collect Egypt as well.
Yeah.
I've got enough on my plate. It's interesting,
but
actually.
Mike,
I started.
Mike, you're right.
Originally, I looked at when I started to look at specialising. It was the Great Britain Overprint Society I went to because, of course, the Middle East forces and the occupation.
Yeah.
And of course, in the catalogue, the pages before are
Egypt.
It's in Egypt.
Yes.
So, of course, I thought, oh, that looks a bit interesting. So that's how I started that.
And it's been downhill ever since.
Yes. Especially on my bank balance.
Yeah. But there's so much variety. I mean, Mike's absolutely right. I mean, 1935, 2 different Christmas stamps, 2 different ordinary stamps, the Jubilee stamp, last day covers.
Yeah.
And that's just 1 year.
Yeah.
I mean, I find it a lovely area, I must say.
Well, I'm interested because of the military side of it, really. It's and that's what my collecting now is in the military in various places, and there's not enough hours in the day to get involved in it, but there we go.
Oh, I know.
The can I ask what the typical price of a cover like we're looking at now is? I mean, how much do they cost?
Ooh.
It varies a lot, actually. Mick's probably got more information than me. I think I'm right in saying that the Xmas seal on cover generally go for more than the 1 piastre stamp, simply because less were printed. As I mentioned earlier, the 1932 issue is pretty difficult. And then you get the rare items, which can easily go into three figures. The Crown Council 7 from Oascar, the Jubilee on cover first day, the Xmas overprint in 1935 on cover. All of those would be in three figures.
Right. So what's the cheapest army stamp on cover? What?
Oh, the next issue, 1936 onwards.
Right.
Yeah. But for these, Mick, I would say probably the 32 or 33 postal or letter seals, because they were printed a lot more of them. Oh, I've got the wrong one. Probably these ones. But that's on cover. I mean, let me just go up a bit. Bear with me. Because there were philatelists there, you get these sort of things. And then you get whole sheets, and they can go for several £100.
Yeah.
And I think they were sold in sheets of 20. I'm not exactly sure.
Yeah.
And obviously those officers who were philatelists were buying whole sheets and carefully putting them away for another day.
Or whole booklets.
Yeah, indeed.
Yeah.
Indeed.
Yeah.
So I think
they're all issued in booklets.
Yeah. So I think it's very hard to you can pay between £5 and £10 or into several £100 depending on the item.
All right. I'm glad to hear there are some cheap examples.
Well, I was giving a presentation to the Society of Postal Historians the other day, and all the other presentations were full of, the most fantastic rare material. And I presented on Guernsey bisects in the war for 2 months, between using up British stamps and printing local stamps. The post office allowed Guernsey bisects, and with one or two exceptions, they're not particularly expensive. So I ended my presentation saying, well, if you want a new collecting area and you don't want to sell your house, think about Guernsey bisects. These would, on average, be a bit more than Guernsey bisects on average, although in both cases there are some rare examples. But very few of these would be, really heavy amounts of money.
I think you could get these on cover. I was on eBay. I don't know what the site was, and there was about 40 or 50 covers with these postal seals and postal stamps on the back.
Yeah.
And they all started off at about £5. So I very carefully put in loads of bids, and they crept up. And at the end of the day, I think I managed to buy 3 and they were about £20 each. And so somebody was buying them. And there was an awful lot for sale then.
I think between £10 and £20 would be what I would think to be average on these, Mick.
Yeah.
I'll have a look for some at Stampex, but I think when I've looked previously, the prices are so expensive.
Some of them are ridiculous.
Some of them are. I say, if you want to collect these sort of things, these weren't cheap, but something like this wouldn't be that expensive, as long as it wasn't. That's the number 7. That is expensive, but that one wouldn't be expensive.
Thank you.
The most rare item is in the next section, which is the 3mm green, the second king. I can't remember, is it Farouk or Fuad, but who came first?
Farouk, I think. Farouk.
Word first, Farouk second.
Farouk.
Yeah, well, the King Farouk 3mm on cover is very, very hard to find. I think there's only about 35 known examples. But like anything, the rarities are there, but you can build up a nice collection of non-rarities and not have to go to your wife cap in hand and say, can we sell the house, dear?
No chance. Yeah.
Oh,